They gave me Apache twin sisters as slaves as a reward, but I didn't use them. I let them be free. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Arizona sun burned hard by late morning, pushing down on the desert like it meant to flatten everything under it. Sheriff Boone Laramie rode slowly through the red dirt stretch that led into a broken mesa. His horse breathed heavily beneath him, each hoofstep leaving behind a dark, sweat-soaked print. He didn't push the animal, he never did. Slung behind the saddle, tied tight with rawhide and blood, a half-dead man bounced with every lurch of the trail, a bounty that had taken Boone 6 days to catch and nearly 2 more to drag back alive. The outlaw had been camped in the foothills west of Apache Gorge, stealing stock, shooting ranchers, and disappearing into stone like smoke. Boone had tracked him without sleep the last night, waited for him to lower his guard, and wrestled him down with rope and pistol, but it hadn't been clean. The outlaw was a big man and wild with fever, but Boone got him alive. That was the deal. As Boone approached the edge of town, his eyes took in the same landmarks they always did. McCrady's empty blacksmith shed, the church with its leaning steeple, the dry trough outside Calhoun's saloon. The place looked the same as it did 5 years ago, when he rode in with a badge freshly pinned. Now he wore that same badge inside his coat where no one could see it. Boone wasn't from Broken Mesa. He was born near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the second son of a farmer and a quiet woman who died early and left a hole in the family no one patched. He joined the war too young, left it older than he wanted to be, and took up the badge thinking it would fix something. It didn't. After the mess at Agua Fria, after what he'd done there, he hung it up and disappeared for half a decade. When the town begged him back last year, he didn't answer. Then they sent a boy with a gunshot wound through the gut, and Boone figured he owed someone something. So he came. This bounty was supposed to be simple. Bring him back, get paid, stay quiet. Boone dismounted slowly when he reached the wide steps of the town hall. The outlaw lay unmoving on the sledge behind him, his breathing shallow but still present. Boone tied his horse to the post and looked up. Councilman Pritchard was already waiting, along with 2 clean-cut traders Boone didn't know. The town liked to dress its business up in vests and trimmed mustaches, but Boone knew the kind. They never broke a horse, never worked a shovel, never got their hands bloody unless it paid double. "You got him," Pritchard said, stepping forward, voice too loud for the quiet street. "Didn't think you'd make it back, not with the way folks he shoots." Boone didn't bother with a reply. He pulled a key from his belt, one that had locked the outlaw's wrist irons, and dropped it into the man's hand. "He's alive," Boone said flatly. "That was the condition. Alive, paid full." Pritchard smirked and gave a little nod to the trader behind him. "That he is. Well, Sheriff, you'll be glad to know the council's decided to reward you with more than silver." He stepped aside. "We've got something else." A door opened. 2 women stepped out. They were young, Apache, barefoot, wristbound in thick hemp rope. Their dresses were worn thin, stained from travel and dirt. Their hair hung long and black, unbrushed, faces still and hard. They didn't look at anyone. Not at Boone, not at each other, just forward. "They're twins," Pritchard said, like that detail sweetened the offer. "Taken off a trader caravan near the border. Nobody claimed. We figured you might want something for the cabin. Company, help, whatever suits you." Boone's jaw tightened, barely noticeable. He didn't move, didn't speak. "We're not legally bound to keep them," Pritchard went on, voice quickening like he could feel the moment slipping. "They're no use to us, and if we let them loose, they'll either die or go back to raiding parties. But in your hands, well," he gestured between Boone and the twins, "it's a mercy, Sheriff, and a fair trade." Boone's hand moved slowly to the hunting knife strapped to his hip. The councilman stiffened, watching, but Boone didn't draw it in anger. He stepped forward, reached toward the nearest woman. Her skin flinched subtly, but she didn't move. He used the knife to cut the rope binding her wrists, then did the same for the other. The rope fell in a clump between their feet. He handed the knife back to Pritchard without a word, turned, walked down the steps, and climbed back onto his horse. "Wait a second," Pritchard called, but Boone didn't stop. He rode straight down Main Street, back the way he came. He didn't look over his shoulder. The women didn't follow at first. They stood still, unbound, unmoving. Then after a minute, they turned and began to walk, not toward shelter, not toward the saloon or the market, but after him. Quiet steps, measured pace, not running, not asking, just following. The sun was low when Boone reached his land. He lived about 2 miles out in a small, wood-framed cabin built by hand, piece by piece, after the war. And behind it stood a crooked barn, a narrow corral, and an old hand-dug well that never ran clean but hadn't run dry either. He slid off his horse, led it into the stable, and unsaddled it by feel. When he stepped out again, he saw them, the two women, 20 yards off near the fence line, watching. Boone stared at them for a long moment. They didn't step forward. He left the barn door open, walked into his cabin, and shut the door behind him. Half an hour passed. Then the door creaked again, and Boone came out carrying a tin plate. He walked to the porch, set the plate down at the top step, and went back inside. By morning, the plate was empty. The women were sitting near the barn, leaning against the outer wall, wrapped in old saddle blankets. They hadn't run. They hadn't spoken. They were still there. Boone stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, looking out at them. He didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't a rescuer. He hadn't brought them home. He didn't even know if he wanted them there. But something about the way they stayed, silent, watching, waiting, told him they weren't looking for permission. They just needed somewhere to stop, somewhere quiet. He turned, went back inside, and brewed another cup. Then he set out 3 mugs the next morning and didn't say a word. The morning air was cooler than the day before. A pale haze hung low over the field behind Boone's cabin, where wild grass clung to the last of spring's moisture before summer would burn it dry. Boone stood on the porch in his usual spot, sipping from a tin cup that steamed faintly. He didn't glance toward the barn, but he knew they were still there. He'd heard them shift in the night. Soft movement, no talking, just the quiet shuffle of blankets against dirt. He wasn't sure what he expected when he rode away from town without saying a word. He hadn't told them to come, hadn't asked them to stay. He'd given no instructions, no offer, no warning. But here they were. That part still sat heavy on him. What did it mean exactly? Cutting their ropes, walking away, and leaving a plate of beans. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He didn't even know how. The door creaked behind him. Boone stepped back inside, grabbed the old coffee pot off the stove, and poured 2 more mugs. He carried them out and placed them gently on the edge of the porch, one on either side of the step. Then he went back to his chair, sat, and waited. 10 minutes passed before the barn door shifted open. Aloe came out first, the older one, so. He only knew her name because it had been scribbled on a paper the councilman gave him and never asked back. She didn't look at Boone directly. She had her hair braided that morning, and her step was slow but even. Naya followed close behind, barefoot and silent. Her hands were wrapped in the blanket from last night, and Boone noticed her shoulders were drawn tight against the morning chill. They stopped a few feet from the porch. Boone didn't move, didn't speak. Eventually, Aloe stepped forward, crouched, and picked up 1 mug. She didn't say anything, just turned, handed the other to Naya, and the 2 of them sat near the low fence line. They drank slowly. Boone returned his gaze to the field. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. That was the rhythm for the next 3 days. He'd bring food out to the steps, dry cornbread, stew if he made some, jerky if nothing else, and leave it without a word. The twins would appear from the barn around the same time each day, take the food, drink the coffee, and return to the barn. They didn't step inside his cabin. They didn't ask for anything, and Boone didn't offer more than what he already gave. But each day, something changed, even if just slightly. On the second morning, Naya gathered eggs from the chicken coop before Boone could get to it. She left them in a neat row on a worn cloth near the pump. She never said a word about it. On the third morning, Aloe patched one of his shirts. Boone found it folded and stitched, laid out on the porch rail. He hadn't asked, hadn't left it for her to mend, but she did it anyway. He began to notice small things, the way Aloe watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, eyes sharp and alert, like she was always waiting to understand what kind of man he really was. The way Naya kept to the animals, always brushing the old mule's coat or feeding the hens scraps, hands gentle like she'd been around livestock most of her life. There was a quiet to her, yes, but not weakness, just something closed off, like it had been stepped on one too many times. He didn't ask what had happened before they ended up behind that door in town hall. He didn't need the details. He'd seen enough in his life to know what people did when no one was watching. The paper Pritchard had handed him said they were salvaged from a trader's caravan. No name, no tribe, no family, no record of where they came from or how long they'd been passed around. That was the kind of thing men in Broken Mesa didn't say out loud. But Boone understood what it meant. He had the decency not to ask them to speak it. That night, a light rain rolled in from the west, tapping against the roof. Boone sat by the small hearth, boots off, shirt hung to dry. He could hear them still moving in the barn, shifting hay, dragging crates, then silence, a long stretch of it. He stood, went to the door and looked out. The barn door was cracked open. He couldn't see much past the dark, just shadows and the faint smell of wet earth. For a moment, Boone considered going back to his chair, but something about the night made him uneasy. He grabbed his coat, stepped off the porch, and walked through the rain. Inside the barn, Alla was curled up in the straw with her sister beside her. A blanket covered both of them, but Boone could see the way Naya was shaking beneath it. She had a fever. He could tell by her breath, quick and shallow, and the damp shine on her brow. Allo looked up as he stepped inside. Her expression wasn't surprised, but tense. Boone crouched slowly, not too close. She's sick. Allo didn't speak, just nodded once. He took a breath. I'll bring something. He turned, went back to the cabin, and gathered a basin of water, clean rags, and the last of his willow tincture. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough from his army days. He carried everything back to the barn and set it down beside them. He didn't say anything else, just sat on the opposite side of the barn and waited. For the next few hours, he stayed nearby, changed out the rag when the fever climbed, gave Naya sips of water when she could swallow. Allo didn't leave her sister's side. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but there was a quiet panic in her eyes that Boone had seen before in foxholes, in widows, in men carrying too much weight. At some point during the night, Nia stopped shivering. Her breathing evened out. Allo leaned her head back against the post behind her and closed her eyes. Boone didn't move. He just sat there in the dark barn and with the rain outside and the two sisters curled under an old horse blanket. He didn't know what came next. He hadn't planned for any of this. But they were here now, and they were still breathing. That counted for something. By morning, the rain had stopped. The air outside was thick and still, the kind that made every creak of wood or distant bird call seem louder than it was. Boone stood outside the barn with the door cracked behind him, rolling up his sleeves. He hadn't slept. He never did well when things were uncertain, and having someone under his roof or near it, burning with fever, was more weight than he was used to carrying. Inside, Naya was finally resting deeper. Her face had color again, not much, but enough to know the worst had passed. Boone had seen men not survive less. She was stronger than she looked. Allo hadn't slept either. She sat beside her sister, back straight, hands folded. She kept the damp cloth on Naya's forehead all night, changing it out herself without asking, doing what needed to be done. When Boone returned just before dawn with more clean water, she looked up and for the first time met his eyes without dropping hers. There was no fear in her face, just exhaustion and something else, something steadier. Boone didn't speak. He set the water down and backed away, letting her keep the space. The barn had always been for tools and horses, but now the hay corner had been cleared, a few crates pulled together to form a makeshift cot. Boone didn't know when they did that, but it made sense. The sisters had carved out a place for themselves without asking, and he hadn't stopped them. Back at the house, he warmed leftover beans and corn in a pan and split it 3 ways. When he stepped out onto the porch, only Allo was outside. She approached quietly, took the plate, and this time paused a second longer before nodding once, in acknowledgement. It wasn't a thank you, but it was the closest he'd gotten. Boone gave her a slight nod back and returned to his seat. He ate slowly, watching the light rise over the field. It had been a long while since anyone shared this land with him. He come here after everything went wrong in Agua Fria. Yeah, just after the shootout, after the marshal's office collapsed under its own weight, after the killing he never talked about. He hadn't planned to stay long, just wanted a quiet place to lay low. But the place grew on him. He built the fence, the coop, fixed the well. The cabin, patched together from old plans and hardwood, became something that kept him breathing. Until now, it had only ever held him and the wind. Later that afternoon, Aloe came to the pump. She worked the handle herself, filled a small tin bucket, then turned back toward the barn. Boone noticed the way she moved, shoulders straight, hands careful. She didn't act like someone waiting for orders. She carried herself like someone who'd stopped asking permission a long time ago. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm Boone hadn't expected. Naya's fever broke, and though she was still weak, she managed to sit up and eat solid food. Aloe spent most of the daylight hours tending the barn, brushing the mule, sweeping the floor, mending what she could find worth fixing. Boone didn't ask her to do any of it. She just did. And a strange thing was, it made things quieter, easier. He hadn't wanted anyone near his routines, not for years. But he found himself leaving tools where she could find them, sharpening extra knives, making more food than usual. On the third evening, as he was pulling nails from an old fence rail behind the cabin, he heard footsteps. Aloe stood a few yards away, her arms crossed, something bundled in cloth held at her side. She hesitated, then stepped forward and held it out. Boone took it. It was the shirt she'd mended earlier, this time fully cleaned and pressed flat. The stitching along the torn seam was strong, tighter than he'd have done himself. Boone nodded once, slowly. "Thank you." She didn't answer, but didn't look away either. There was a pause between them that hung heavy, but not uncomfortable. She seemed to be measuring him again, watching his face, his posture. Boone let her. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn. That night, Boone sat on the porch longer than usual. The sun had dropped, leaving only a pink smear on the edge of the horizon. Crickets had started up in the brush. He watched the barn, saw the faint flicker of a lantern inside, and listened to the quiet thud of footsteps now and then. He thought back to the councilman's voice that day. "We figured you'd appreciate something more enduring." The anger hit him slow but deep. The idea that two living, breathing women had been handed off like saddle stock still churned his gut. He hadn't planned to take anyone in, wasn't looking for change, but it was happening anyway. Aloe and Naya hadn't spoken more than a few words since they arrived. They didn't explain why they followed him, why they stayed, or what they wanted. But Boone was beginning to understand that wasn't what mattered. Some people didn't need to talk to make themselves clear. By morning, he made up his mind. They weren't going anywhere unless they wanted to. He didn't care what the town said, didn't care about the papers or who thought they belonged to whom. He'd make sure they had a place here. That was enough for now. Boone rose before sunrise, same as always. The air was cold and dry, the kind that sank into your joints and warned that spring was starting to bow out. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and sat at the table with one hand wrapped around his mug, watching steam rise off the metal. It had been almost a week since the women had arrived. They still hadn't stepped inside the cabin, but their presence had spread across the property. Subtle, quiet, unspoken. Every tool he reached for was where it should be. The animals were calm, fed, brushed. His boots, once kicked off by habit, were now set neatly by the door. He didn't ask for it. They didn't ask permission, but things were changing. By the time the sun cleared the hills, Boone had 2 mugs of coffee cooling on the porch rail and a third in his hand. He glanced toward the barn. Aloe was already outside tying a rope to the fence post. She was trying to repair a loose section that had been sagging for weeks, something he meant to get to, but hadn't. Naya sat on an overturned bucket near the chicken coop, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a small tin bowl in her lap. She was slowly feeding a lame hen by hand. Boone stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence. Aloe didn't look up right away, focused on pulling the rope taut, looping it around twice before knotting it. She stood back to check her work, then finally glanced toward him. Boone set the mug down on the fence post beside her. "It'll hold better if you drive a new post in here," he said. His voice was even. Not instructional, just fact. Aloe looked at him, then the post, then gave a small nod. "Okay." It was the first word she'd spoken to him since they'd arrived. Her voice was low, steady. Boone didn't react outwardly, but something in his chest settled a bit. "I'll bring one from the pile after I finish morning feed," he said. Aloe didn't answer, but she didn't turn away either. They stood there a moment, both facing the same piece of fence. Boone picked up the coil of rope at his feet and walked off toward the barn without looking back. Later that day, as the wind picked up and blew dust low across the field, Boone worked at splitting logs behind a shed. He hadn't realized how fast the firewood pile was shrinking with 3 people on the land instead of 1. The extra hands helped, sure, but winter would come back around eventually, and Boone didn't like to be caught unprepared. When he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he noticed Naya sitting nearby under the shade of a mesquite tree. She was watching him, not staring, not cautious, just present. He'd grown used to that quiet gaze. She watched the world like someone who'd learned not to trust it, but hadn't given up entirely. He could relate to that. He leaned on the axe handle and took a sip from his canteen. "You feeling better?" he asked, voice even. Naya nodded. Her blanket had slipped off her shoulder, and she tugged it back up, tucking it close. "Yes." Another word, another brick down. "You've been around chickens before." She shrugged gently. "My grandfather raised them before." Boone didn't press. He didn't need the rest of the sentence. Before could mean any number of things. Before the war, before the raids, before the traders, before they were taken. "You're good with them," he said. "They follow you more than they follow me." Naya gave the smallest of smiles, almost nothing, but it reached her eyes for a second. Then she looked down. Aloe came from around the corner just then, carrying 2 fence posts balanced across her shoulder. She glanced at her sister, then at Boone, but said nothing. She didn't need to. There was no tension in her body, no alarm, just acknowledgement. She passed by him, her steps sure and direct, and disappeared toward the fence line again. That night, Boone laid out 3 plates at the table. He left the door to the cabin open as he ate, light from the oil lamp spilling out onto the porch. A while passed, long enough that he figured they weren't coming in. He wasn't surprised. Then he heard light footsteps on the porch. Aloe stepped in first. Her dress was clean, her hair in a new braid. Nia followed, arms folded in front of her, eyes moving slowly around the room like she was studying every detail. They paused just inside the doorway. Boone didn't say anything. He just gestured with a tilt of his head toward the chairs. They sat. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a moment that would mean anything to someone on the outside, but it meant something here in this quiet space where nothing was said and everything was. They ate slowly. The clink of forks against tin plates filled the silence. Boone poured more coffee when the cups emptied. Naya took seconds. Aloe didn't. Afterward, Aloe stood and began collecting the plates. Boone moved to stop her. "You don't have to." She looked at him, direct, calm. "I want to." He let her. The kitchen had never felt like a place for more than one person. But now, as he watched her rinsing dishes in the basin while Nia dried them with a worn cloth, it felt like something different. Not full, but no longer empty either. That night, Boone stepped out to the porch while the sisters stayed inside a little longer. He looked up at the stars. The breeze had shifted, warm and dry again, the kind that said another season was turning. He hadn't meant to build anything here. He'd come to hide, to wait out the noise and guilt of the past, but something was taking shape, slow and steady, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to run from it. By mid-morning, the heat had settled back over the land like a heavy coat. Boone stood near the barn, sharpening his axe on a wet stone block, while Aloe tied up bundles of kindling behind him. She'd been out there since dawn, working without being told, same as she'd done every day for the past 2 weeks. Naya was down by the stream bed with a metal basin, scrubbing the clothes they'd laid out for washing the night before. The sisters had started taking over more and more of the daily labor without asking, without fanfare. It was an obligation. They did it like it was simply what made sense, like they'd already decided this was their home. Whether Boone said it or not, he didn't stop them. He hadn't spoken to either of them much beyond what was necessary, short, honest words about chores, animals, weather. But he had been watching. Boone wasn't a man who rushed to judgment. He'd seen too much death, too much betrayal, wearing decent faces. But every day, the women stayed. Something about them started pushing deeper into his thoughts, not in a way that confused him, not in a way he didn't understand. He just hadn't figured out what to do with it yet. Alo, in particular, had a way of carrying herself that stuck with him. Always composed, always alert. When she worked like it mattered. When she rested like someone who didn't take peace for granted. There was no softness to her, not in the way most men thought of women, but there was steadiness. There was grit, and Boone respected it more than he could say. As for Nia, she'd become the soul of the chickens. Boone had never seen animals respond like that before. She walked through the yard with two of the hens trailing behind her like shadows. The old mule let her clean its ears, and the dog that had once snapped at anyone but Boone now slept at her feet in the shade. There was something maternal about her, something tired too, but not bitter. He guessed she must have helped raise younger siblings back wherever she came from. The council hadn't said much about what tribe they belonged to. Boone figured it didn't matter. Whatever had come before, family, land, name, it had been ripped away. And yet, they carried themselves like women who refused to vanish. That mattered more than the past. As noon approached, Boone stepped into the barn to escape the heat. He tossed the axe onto the workbench and peeled off his gloves, wiping sweat from his brow. That's when he noticed Nia standing in the doorway, holding a folded cloth in her hands. She stepped in quietly, a little unsure. "I fixed the lining," she said, offering the cloth to him. Boone opened it. It was his coat, the one he wore on longer rides, the one with the torn inside pocket that had been catching on his holster every time he drew. He looked at the stitching. Tight, careful, clean. "Appreciate it," he said. She gave a small nod, then hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of the folded cloth she'd used. "My sister says we should go into town soon," she said, softer now. Boone looked up. "Why?" "To buy things for winter. Salt, cloth, maybe boots. We've been living off what's here, but it won't last forever." Boone hadn't thought about it yet, but she was right. He planned for one man through the season, not three. "You don't have coin," he said flatly. Nia looked at him, not offended, just steady. "We don't, but we can come." The implication was clear. They weren't asking to be given anything. They were asking to be treated as part of the decision-making. It sat heavier on Boone than it should have because part of him still didn't know what they were to him. Not wards, not prisoners, not guests, something else. He gave a slow nod. "We'll ride in Friday morning." Nia's shoulders eased. She gave him a faint smile and stepped back out into the sunlight. That night, Boone sat on the porch with a rifle across his lap, watching the stars come up. The women had already gone inside. He could hear the faint sound of water being poured into a basin, of Nia humming something low and steady. Alo's footsteps passed once by the doorway and then quieted. He found himself thinking about the town, broken Mesa, and what folks might say when he rode in with the two of them beside him. He didn't care for town gossip, but he'd seen the way Pritchard had looked at them, the way the men in council kept their voices casual while their eyes lingered. Boone knew exactly what kind of thoughts ran through those minds. He wasn't worried about them talking. He was worried about them trying something. If they did, they'd learn quick. The badge he kept tucked inside his coat might be hidden, but it hadn't lost its meaning. Early the next morning, Boone caught Alo behind the cabin, chopping vegetables at the outdoor table. The sun was still low, barely up over the ridge. She glanced at him once, then back down at the cutting board. "We're going to town Friday," he said. She didn't stop chopping. "I know, Nia told me. You worried about going back there?" he asked. Alo paused, then looked at him, measured. "I'm not worried about the town," she said. "Only about how people treat those they think don't belong." Boone didn't respond at first. Then he nodded once. "They don't speak for me." Alo looked at him for a long beat. "We know." That was the end of it. She went back to chopping. Boone went to saddle the mule. But in that one exchange, something shifted. They weren't just staying, they were starting to trust. The sun rose hot on Friday, riding high before noon and bleeding down on broken Mesa like it aimed to punish. Dust rolled up beneath every hoofstep as Boone led his mule down the main street with Ali walking beside him, and Naya seated sideways in the saddle, one hand on the pack and the other shielding her eyes from the glare. They didn't say much on the way into town. There wasn't much to say. Boone had gone silent the moment the ridge cleared and rooftops came into view. He didn't wear his badge, as usual, but his coat was buttoned and his revolver sat high on his hip. He didn't plan to use it, but if something went sideways, he wouldn't hesitate. They passed the general store, the saloon, the empty bank with its boarded windows. Heads turned. No surprise. Word had gotten around quickly after that day, with the bounty and the rope and the cut cords. Folks always pretended not to notice things they didn't understand, but they noticed just the same. And now here he was, weeks later, riding in with both women like it was normal. Some stopped talking, others leaned back in chairs, watching. Boone kept walking. Inside the store, the scent of dry grain and iron tools clung to the air. Allo stepped in first, calm and collected, her shoulders straight. Naya followed quietly, taking in the shelves, the rows of tinware, bolts of cloth, the small barrels of rock, salt, and flour. Boone scanned the room. A teenage boy stood behind the counter where the old clerk used to be, a new hire. The boy looked nervous, eyes bouncing between Boone's sidearm and the two women. "We'll need dried beans, flour, hardtack, and salt," Boone said, stepping to the counter. 3 yards of wool, brown or gray, and boots, size 5 and 6. The boy nodded too fast. "Yes, sir." He disappeared behind the back curtain. Allo wandered toward the fabric shelf. She ran her hand across a bolt of worn wool, then turned to Boone. "This one's thick," she said. "Good for winter." He nodded. "That'll do." Naya was crouched near the bottom shelf now, examining a row of canning jars. She touched one gently and said nothing, but her gaze lingered. Boone stepped beside her. "You can take 2. She looked up. "We can make jam." "From what?" he asked, not unfriendly. "There's wild blackberries down by the creek," she said. "I saw them last week." He gave a slight nod. "All right." They paid in coin and traded for what they didn't cover. Boone had brought 3 cleaned rabbit pelts and a sack of dried herbs, things the store always took when coin was short. The boy bagged everything without comment. But when Boone turned to leave, he caught sight of Councilman Pritchard standing just outside the store window, arms crossed. Boone stopped, met his eyes through the glass. The man didn't move. Outside, the heat was thicker. Pritchard stepped into their path as they came out, eyes narrowing on the 2 women first before settling on Boone. "You're making a statement, Sheriff," he said flatly. "I'm buying supplies," Boone answered. Pritchard smirked. "They still under your roof?" Boone didn't answer right away. His jaw shifted slightly. "They live with me," he said finally. "They work. They're free. That's all there is to it." "Folks are talking." "They always do." Allo stepped closer, not behind Boone, but beside him. Pritchard's eyes flicked toward her, then away. "Just make sure your arrangements stay civil," Pritchard muttered, then tipped his hat with a motion that meant nothing and turned away. They left town in silence, Boone leading the mule again, the bags tied tight. No one followed. No one tried anything, but the eyes stayed on their backs until the town fell behind them. Back at the cabin, the mood shifted. Naya unpacked the goods and began preparing a small pot of stew, setting aside flour and dried beans into neat rows in the storage bins. Allo placed the wool on the bed, running her hand along the fold again. Boone sat on the porch. He hadn't said a word since they left town. His shoulders were tight. He didn't like being confronted in front of them, didn't like being reminded of how easy it would be for people to twist what was simple. He'd expected something in town, just hadn't known it would come that directly. Allo stepped out quietly and sat on the porch rail across from him. "You worried about what they'll say?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No." "You looked like you were." Boone leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm not worried about talk. I'm worried some drunk might believe it gives him permission." She nodded once. "We can handle ourselves." "I know," he said, "but I still keep watch." They sat in silence a while. Then she spoke again, more quietly. "We're not leaving." He looked at her. "We weren't sure at first," she added, But we've decided. We stay. He didn't say anything right away, just let it sit. Then he gave one small nod. All right. That night, they shared dinner inside. No door open, no distance. After they ate, Boone poured a small bit of coffee and sat by the hearth. Allo lingered at the table, watching the firelight move across the walls. Naya came behind her and placed a hand gently on Boone's shoulder as she passed. It was soft, brief, but he felt it. Something had shifted again. Not loudly, just surely. The nights grew colder by the day. Boone had started bringing in more wood from the far ridge, stacking it by the side of the cabin with quiet urgency. The leaves along the dry creek bed had browned early, brittle underfoot. It wouldn't be long before frost made its way in. Inside the cabin, the changes were small but undeniable. The women now moved through the space like it belonged to them too. They swept without being asked, set the table without waiting. Nia had taken to humming under her breath while she cooked, something soft and melodic, maybe from another life. Boone didn't ask. Allo cleaned the rifle without prompting, tied off a loose hinge on the barn door, patched the tear in the bed quilt. She didn't ask either. Boone still kept his words few, but his actions had shifted. He no longer sat alone on the porch in the mornings. He waited until Nia handed him a second mug. He no longer left the cabin to give them space. He stayed when they sat, when they spoke softly between themselves, when they worked in a quiet way only people with shared grief can. That evening, Boone returned from checking the western fence line. One of the rails had split, likely from dry rot, and needed replacement. When he stepped up onto the porch, he found Naya already waiting by the door, holding out a bowl of stew. "I added wild onion," she said quietly. Boone took the bowl and gave a short nod. "Smells good." She didn't move right away. Her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, and Boone, sensing something unsaid, waited. "I remember what it felt like being owned," she said suddenly. Boone looked up at her. "I didn't say anything before. I wasn't ready, but I want you to know when they gave us to you, I expected you to take us like they wanted." Boone's jaw tightened. He set the bowl on the porch railing, carefully. "I didn't take anything." "I know," she said, almost a whisper. "That's why we stayed." She turned and walked inside. He remained there for a moment, hands still. Her words had opened something he hadn't let himself touch, the simple, brutal truth of how they arrived. He pushed it down, focused on the work, the day-to-day tasks. But hearing it from her, unafraid, calm, made it real in a way he couldn't ignore. When Boone entered this cabin later, Alla was tending the fire, one hand braced against her knee. She glanced at him as he came in, her eyes quiet but firm. She had something on her mind too. He could feel it. He washed up at the basin, dried his hands, and sat at the table. She joined him. "We can't go back," Allo said without preamble. "Even if we wanted to, there's no family left. No land, no camp. It's gone." Boone nodded slowly. "You don't have to tell me, not unless you want to." "I'm telling you because we've made a choice," she said. "You need to know it's not out of need." He looked across at her. "Then why?" Allo's eyes didn't waver. "Because this place feels like something we've never had, not even before they took us. And you never touched us. You never gave us orders. You didn't try to explain us to yourself or ask for anything. You just let us be." Boone leaned back in the chair. He didn't know what to say, but she wasn't looking for words. She just needed to be heard. Later that night, as they sat in the soft, orange glow of the fire, Boone felt something he hadn't felt in years. Ease. Nia sat cross-legged near the hearth, her hands curled around a cup. Allo sat across from him, legs drawn beneath her, head resting back against the wall. Then, without fanfare, she stood up, walked over to him, and stopped inches away. Boone looked up. Allo knelt down slowly beside his chair. "I'm not offering because I owe you, Mom," she said. "I'm offering because I want to." He didn't move for a long moment. Then he reached out, touched her face gently, and leaned in. Their lips met, quiet, steady, without desperation. A simple kiss, but not a small one. It was the first touch that had meaning, not out of comfort, not out of debt, but out of choice. She stayed close after, her head resting lightly against his chest, her breath steady. Boone sat motionless, arms around her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. He didn't ask her for more. He didn't need to. That moment was enough. Later, when they rose, she returned to her corner of the cabin and settled in. Boone stood by the door a while longer, looking out over the quiet land. The stars were sharp in the sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he no longer felt like he was waiting for it to end. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd come home. The first frost came early that year. Thin white crystals clung to the fence posts and the grass behind the barn before the sun had a chance to lift. Boone stood outside just before dawn, breath visible in the cold, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug. He'd risen earlier than usual, couldn't sleep. The kiss from 2 nights ago hadn't left his mind. Not for a moment, not because of guilt or confusion, but because something had changed since then. Something quiet, but firm. The space between him and Aloe wasn't filled with silence anymore. It was filled with something understood, something earned. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled with the first batch of kindling. Boone had stacked the wood higher by the wall now, more than enough to get them through to spring. Naya stirred a pot of dried apples and oats at the stove, still wrapped in a shawl, her bare feet tucked under her long skirt. She moved slower lately. Boone had noticed it. She took more breaks. Her hands cradled her middle longer after bending down. He hadn't asked. But this morning, as she poured hot water over tea leaves and leaned into the counter with a soft exhale, Aloe stepped up beside her. They exchanged a look. Quiet, familiar. Then Naya nodded once, and Aloe turned toward Boone. "She's with child," Aloe said simply. Boone didn't answer right away. His eyes met Naya's. Her posture didn't change. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't ashamed. She just waited for him to understand it. "How long?" Boone asked. "A few months," Aloe said. "It happened before we met you, back when we were still—" She trailed off, but the meaning didn't need filling. Boone set his mug down on the table. "Do either of you need anything?" Naya looked at him, surprised, not because of what he said, but because he said it without judgment. "We'll need linen," she said after a moment, "and more broad stock herb for pain." "All right," Boone said. "We'll make another run before the snow." He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He simply added the news to the list of things he now had to carry and move forward. Aloe watched him carefully, measuring his reaction like she had on that first day. She saw what she needed to see. Later that morning, Boone rode into the western stretch of the property with Aloe seated behind him. It wasn't common. She didn't often ride with him, but the stream's bank had shifted, and the fence there was too close to give under runoff. He needed a second pair of hands to hold the stakes. As they rode, Aloe leaned her head against his back, arms light around his middle. She hadn't done that before. Boone felt the weight of it, deliberate, calm, unafraid. They reached the broken section near midday. Aloe dismounted without needing help. She took up the hammer and post while Boone held the wire. They worked side by side for nearly an hour, not speaking. At one point, she brushed the hair out of her face and looked at him. "We didn't plan to stay with you this long," she said. "Back in the beginning, we thought maybe a week, then we'd move on." "I know," Boone said. "But you didn't ask us to leave, even when it would have been easier." "No," he said. "Didn't want to." Aloe paused. "I've spent most of my life being told where I could and couldn't go, who I belonged to, what I was worth. You never asked anything from us, not once." Boone drove the last stake into the ground. "I didn't need to." She stepped closer, lowering the hammer. "And now?" Boone looked at her, really looked. Her eyes didn't challenge him. They asked him to speak plainly. "I don't want either of you to leave," he said. "Not now, not ever." Aloe let out a quiet breath and stepped forward, resting her forehead briefly against his chest. "Then we won't." They stayed like that for a while under the gray sky, between the posts and the cold breeze. The land around them was dry and silent, but the stillness between them wasn't empty anymore. It felt rooted, decided. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sky had begun to darken. Nia had started a fire, her cheeks warm, her eyes heavy with sleep. Boone helped her settle into the chair near the hearth and handed her the last of the willow bark tea. "You'll need rest in the weeks ahead," he said. "I'm not helpless," she replied, voice soft but steady. "I didn't say you were," Boone answered. But I've got two hands, and so does Aloe. You won't have to do this alone. She looked at him, really looked, and then nodded once. Thank you. That night, the cabin was quiet. The wind picked up, tapping against the windows. Boone stepped out for a minute before bed, the cold biting his knuckles. He stood under the stars and let the stillness settle over him. There had been a time when he never thought he'd see past the guilt of Agua Fria, a time when he thought all he was good for was survival and silence. But now, inside that cabin, a new life was forming. A woman he trusted lay sleeping in his bed. Another woman he respected carried a child. Not his, but not unloved. He'd built a life here, not loud, not clean, but solid. And for the first time in years, he didn't wonder what came next. He knew he was staying. The baby came in early spring, just as the last frost melted out of the soil. The ground was still stubborn and the night still bit at the bones, but green had started pushing through, small signs that the worst of winter was behind them. Boone had spent the previous weeks readying the cabin as best he could. He sealed the windows tighter, hauled in more water, packed down straw in the barn in case extra shelter was needed. He wasn't a midwife, wasn't even sure he'd be useful when the time came. But he prepared the way he always did, quietly, thoroughly, without asking for thanks. Aloe took over most of the care during the final days before Nia went into labor. She spoke more now, mostly with Nia, but even Boone could tell the edge in her voice had softened. She wasn't watching him with suspicion anymore. She was just watching, like she belonged here, like she'd always belonged. The birth happened just before dawn, in the quiet hours when the fire had burned low and the coyotes were still calling in the distance. Boone didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with his coat wrapped around him and his rifle across his lap, not out of fear, but from habit. His thoughts stayed inside with Nia's cries, muffled behind the cabin wall, Aloe's calm instructions drifting through. He didn't move until the sound changed, until a second, smaller cry rose up in the dark and silenced everything else. He stood, but he didn't go in, not right away. When the door creaked open, Aloe stepped outside, breath visible in the cold. "She's all right," she said. "So's the baby." Boone just nodded, a slow breath leaving his lungs. "Boy or girl?" "Girl," Aloe said. "Small, strong." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. He walked inside minutes later. The air was warm from the stove. Nia lay wrapped in blankets, pale and tired, but with a peace Boone hadn't seen in her before. The baby was asleep in her arms, wrapped in one of Aloe's stitched cloths. Boone stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, hat in hand, not sure if he belonged in that scene. Then Nia looked at him and gave a faint smile. "You want to hold her?" she asked, voice weak but certain. Boone hesitated, then nodded. Nia shifted slightly and Boone stepped forward, arms out. He cradled the child carefully, as if the smallest movement might break her, but she was heavier than he expected, her tiny fist clenching the edge of the cloth. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but something in his chest stirred, something steady and deep. This wasn't his child, not by blood, but it didn't matter. He was here. He was staying. Over the next weeks, life settled into something that felt permanent. Boone expanded the chicken pen, cleared brush from the east field, helped Nia walk again day by day as strength returned to her limbs. Aloe planted root vegetables with a quiet urgency. The baby, named Wren, a name Nia had whispered one night without needing to explain, slept mostly during the day, cradled in the cabin or swaddled in a sling as Aloe carried her, from task to task. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it had finally loosened its grip. When spring bloomed fully, Boone rode into Broken Mesa for the first time since winter. He didn't go to the store first. He went to the council hall. Pritchard was there, sitting on the porch with two of the other landowners, sipping black coffee and chewing over irrigation contracts. They saw Boone coming before he spoke. He tied off his horse and walked straight to them, shoulders square, jaw tight. "They live with me," Boone said, voice flat but loud enough to cut through the murmur. "You all know it. You've been talking long enough." The men didn't speak at first. Boone continued. "Aloe, Nia, their daughter. They have my land, my fire, My name if they want it. That ain't up for debate. Pritchard shifted in his seat, his smirk forced. You don't owe us an explanation, Laramie. I'm not giving you one, Boone replied. I'm giving you a warning. No one said anything more. Boone turned, mounted his horse, and rode out. Back home, Aloe was hanging linens on the line, the baby strapped to her chest, her braid loose in the breeze. Naya sat in the sunlight with a basket in her lap, shelling beans and humming something slow. Boone rode in, dismounted, and walked to the porch. Aloe turned toward him, reading his face. You went to town. Yeah, Boone said. They won't speak it again. Not in my direction. She gave a short nod, then looked down at Wren, who had started to fuss. Boone stepped closer, took the baby gently, and held her in one arm while using the other to steady the cloth over her shoulder. You think she'll like it here? He asked. She already does, Aloe said. Naya looked up from her basket. We all do. Boone looked out across the land, his fence line, the growing field, the rising smoke from the stove. He felt something settle in his chest that had never been there before. Not in all his years as a lawman, not in the war, not in the silence after. It was peace, not made of grand declarations or promises carved in stone, but of staying, of choosing every day to build something real out of what was broken. And for once, there was no past louder than the present. This was their home now, and no one would take it. The story of Sheriff Boone Laramie and the Apache twin sisters, Aloe and Nia, offers a profound life lesson about the power of compassion and the courage to defy societal norms. Boone's decision to free the sisters, rather than accept them as rewards, reflects a deep respect for human dignity and autonomy. His quiet, steadfast support, offering food, shelter, and freedom without expectation, allowed trust to grow organically, transforming strangers into a family bound by mutual respect and choice. This teaches us that true kindness doesn't demand reciprocation. It creates space for healing and connection, even in the face of a harsh world. Boone's journey from a solitary, guilt-ridden man to someone who builds a home with Aloe, Nia, and baby Wren shows that redemption and purpose can emerge from selfless acts. It's a reminder to look beyond labels and judgments, to see people for who they are, and to offer help without strings attached. In our own lives, we can emulate this by listening, understanding, and acting with empathy, no matter how small the gesture. This story stirs the heart, urging us to reflect on how we treat others and the legacies we build. What lessons did you take from Boone's choices? How have acts of kindness shaped your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. If this tale moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community for more inspiring narratives that challenge, uplift, and connect us. Let's keep the conversation going and spread the power of compassion together.